Hello, I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about women in leadership. I'm Jessica Spence and I'm the President of Brands at Beam Suntory. There's been a lot of work done recently that really highlights the impact of diversity. I think historically diversity was often talked about very much in terms of the type of culture you wanted to represent, the type of purpose your company had. And all of that remains true, but I think what's become really obvious through a lot of good scientific data now is that there is a huge business impact and a positive impact from diversity, particularly at your senior leadership level. Studies that have looked at companies that have diverse teams are showing that they consistently demonstrate higher growth. And a big part of that is because of their ability to tap into new markets. They're also substantially better at innovation. And generally, there is a view that they will be making much better decisions nearly 90% of the time. And of course, all of those add up to a much better performance in terms of profitability. So alongside the more values-based element of diversity, it's very clear that there is a business benefit to this. And in a world where growth is becoming increasingly challenging, that's a critical message for all of us. At Beam Suntory, we have laid out very specific commitments in this area. So we're looking to increase diversity, but also equity and inclusion across the business. And we've set 3 stretching targets for 2030. The first one is that we aim to have 50% of women in leadership. The second, and this is mostly focused within the US, is that we are really looking at our multicultural representation. Our target is to have 45% racial and ethnic representation across the US business by 2030. Those are very much diversity-based targets, but what we've also looked at quite hard is how do we then create the environment in which this diversity can thrive? Having diversity by itself doesn't really give you the benefits if you haven't created the right level of equity and inclusion to support that. And therefore, one of the things that we've looked at very closely is the types of behaviours that we want to see across the business. We've shifted in performance management to now having a 50-50 approach to what and how. So 50% of your assessment is based very much on what you deliver, the tangible business impact, but 50% is on how. How do you demonstrate the values that we know underpin creating an inclusive environment? And that has been really an important shift for us. We've also backed this by the creation of a series of employee impact groups. These have been phenomenal. We have a set of teams who really work alongside the leadership to shape the agenda and critically to give us feedback, to make sure we're hearing the voices, to make sure that we're able to respond and to think about how we need to move as an organisation going forward. So I just wanted to then say, well, if we think about that broader context for diversity, equity and inclusion, is there a specific challenge, particularly relating to women, given the topic today, in travel retail and in the spirits business, perhaps most specifically in travel retail, that can help focus our minds around why this might really matter to us? And we looked at some data here that was really interesting. I think we're all aware that travel retail has been through an incredibly tough year, but we're also very confident that it will come back. And that as we do so, capturing growth is going to be at the heart of what we all need to focus on. And that's going to be where we're looking to support you. What we saw when we looked at the data was when we look at total travel retail, 42% of shoppers are women, but only 33% of buyers. So definitely opportunity there at a general level to drive greater conversion. People are coming into the store, but not necessarily purchasing. What was quite interesting is that that structure is a little bit different when you look at the world of spirits. There, only 31% of shoppers are women. So many fewer women coming into the category, coming into that area of the store. But actually the same percentage of buyers, 33%. So there we have a slightly different challenge. We have a challenge with footfall. We have a challenge with pulling people into that area and actually getting them to engage with the category at all. And if we can address that, given that we are seeing that slightly higher ratio of buyers to shoppers, there could be some exciting growth for us. And this is just one number and an average across many places. But it did say to us, there's definitely something here that we could address. So how do we do that? One of the things that we believe very strongly at Beam Suntory, and there's a lot of data which backs this, is that across all brands and categories, they are built by the experience that consumers have of them. There's a lovely statement that somebody in our company made. It said, brands are just collections of memories. I think that's incredibly insightful. Brands are just constructs in consumers' minds, and they are built from every tiny detail, every touch, every taste, everything they see, every smell in some categories. All of that goes to build up a picture, a memory structure of that brand, and by extension often of that category in consumers' minds. And I think that's even more the case in retail and in travel retail. I think everyone in retail is so conscious that the experience you deliver is your brand. And that's something that I think in consumer goods we're still learning, but has always been there in retail. And the power of that experience to shape your brand, to shape whether people see them engaging with it, whether it feels relevant for them, whether it feels like a place and a product that is right for them and their lifestyle, is incredibly powerful and needs to be very carefully managed. And we know, particularly in the world of travel retail, that personal interaction is one of the most impactful brand building tools we have. So whilst in other channels we don't have the luxury of being able to hand sell, of being able to talk directly to individual consumers in a way that's right for them, that is a phenomenally powerful tool to have at our disposal, and a fantastic one in how flexible it can be as well. So as we think about the world from that perspective, how are we doing? Just wanted to take a quick detour through a world that was very familiar to me for a long time, which is the world of beer, which I worked in for many years. And just say, well, let's have a think about it. If you take a step back, what is the memory we built up here? And here are some visuals that I pulled. I didn't select these with a particularly robust filter. There were plenty of others I could have taken. Honestly, would have told the same story, if not perhaps one that was a little more extreme. But 4 very famous, very well-known campaigns from the world of beer over the last 20 years or so, 20, 30 years, I suppose. And I think what's interesting here is this is building a pretty specific memory when you look at it. It's a very masculine world. The protagonist is male. We actually did an exercise at my previous employer where we looked at about 30 years worth of beer advertising. And we found remarkably few with female protagonists. Women did turn up, but generally waitresses, barmaids, girlfriends. Very rarely did a woman play a role that went beyond being, to be honest, in some cases, window dressing and background to the male protagonist, who was always the consumer of the beer. So when you think about this is a pretty powerful set of memories that are being built up here. There's been a lot of money spent by the industry to build these memories. And guess what? Over time it worked. When you talk to women, one of the key challenges all beer producers will tell you is that they struggle to attract women. Beer is seen as a masculine drink. It's seen as a drink for the boys. It's not seen as a drink for women. Now that's beginning to change slowly, but it is still probably one of the single biggest barriers to beer category growth. And I think you see that in almost every market across the world. And what's incredibly depressing about that from my perspective is that's created. There is nothing inherently gendered about a drink. An alcoholic liquid, brewed or distilled, doesn't have a gender. It doesn't have an ethnicity. It only has what we create for it. So the fact that women see beer as a world they don't belong in, they see beer as a male drink, a masculine drink, that's something we made happen. And we made happen through spending a lot of money behind work that looks like this and building those memories. So how are we doing in whiskey, coming closer to home? Unfortunately, I have to say over the long term, the pattern has been very similar. There's been a lot of some of the most famous advertising campaigns of all time have played into somewhat similar tropes. They use words like chivalry, brotherhood. You see things like, I bet he drinks Johnny Walker Red. This one is a little different one, but I'm not sure if you read the copy whether you think it's necessarily an improvement. And to be very transparent, some of these are quite old. But again, it's the build-up over time. It's the consistency of that messaging over time that sends a signal, that builds a memory for women that this is not their world. This is not a world we expect to see them in. This is not a world that they are necessarily welcomed to. And I think, again, if you talk to people in focus groups, we will often hear that whiskey is a man's world. Whiskey is a world that men are included in, and that women often have to try and break into. And again, that has been created by a lot of spend over a long period of time and will take time to pull apart. So then, turning a little bit closer to home, I thought about, well, how does that play out when you think about travel retail? And I just wanted to contrast the two experiences I have. I spend a lot of time in travel retail, maybe a little bit less in 2020, but for the last 15 years I've been an incredibly frequent flyer, and I feel very at home in many of the airports of the world. So I've been a good customer to many of you. When I think about this, two sides of it, I obviously often spend time in the beauty and the cosmetics area. This is a category I feel very comfortable in. It's one that I research a lot. Personally, I know a lot about. And generally when I go into this space, I know what I'm looking for. I'm on a mission to choose something quite specific that I've looked up or I'm restocking on. But I'm almost always offered help. Now, sometimes, honestly, I don't necessarily want that help because I am fairly clear where I'm going and I'm in a bit of a rush. But it is always there. It is always offered to me. Can they help me find something? Can they make a recommendation? The sales assistants are very present for me. And generally, even when I would be capable of finding it myself, the signal that sends to me is that I'm welcomed in that environment. I'm expected to be there. The imagery I see around me, it portrays a world that I feel I understand, I can see myself in on a good day. But it's very much creating an environment that is signaling to me, it's creating a set of memories that tells me this is my world, this is my place. And that's a wonderful thing. But then I think about what I experience in the whiskey category. And honestly, it's pretty different. I spent a lot of time researching cosmetics. I'm very happy in that world, but I'm also very happy in the whiskey section. In the whiskey section, I'm incredibly rarely approached. I think I've been approached probably a handful of times. And when I am, in the majority of cases, I'm asked if I'm buying a gift. Now, that's very well-meaning advice, and it's probably grounded on data you have that says women are disproportionately less likely to be buying, and if they are buying, they're probably disproportionately more likely to be buying for a gift. But again, that's a set of memories we've just created for me. And the set of memories and the signals that is sending me is that I'm not really expected to be drinking this. This is not really the space I belong. It's good that I'm there, potentially, but it's probably for somebody else. And that does establish over time, again, all of these things. It's never one event. It builds up over a period of years. That establishes for me a message that this is not my world. This is not somewhere I'm necessarily expected to be. And again, that's a strong memory. And I see that in other settings as well. It's never just driven by one channel or one experience. As I said, if I, for instance, go into a bar and my husband and I order a glass of wine and a whiskey on the rocks, 9 times out of 10, the whiskey on the rocks will be put in front of him, even when I clearly ordered it. And again, it's a small thing, but over time that just builds up. It just sends you that message. This isn't what you should be drinking. This isn't the world we expect you to be in. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, does that help or does that hinder our ability to grow? And I would argue that that hinders our ability to grow. And I think I was reflecting on, well, where does this come from? And what is somewhat frustrating is that we have some wonderful stories of incredibly powerful and impactful women in our business. These are 2 stories from the Beam Suntory family, and there are plenty of others from many of our fellow producers. These are 2 ladies called Bessie Williamson. They're standing outside the Lafroig distillery, and Margie Samuels, one of the co-founders of Maker's Mark. Bessie Williamson, whose name will always be linked to Lafroig, was the only woman to run and own a Scottish distillery in the 20th century. And she was absolutely pivotal to making Lafroig one of the world's great whiskies. She joined, taking on a temporary role. She'd been on holiday to the island, saw a vacancy for a shorthand typist, joined the distillery at a relatively young age, worked her way up and took over control. And really led the international expansion of Lafroig as well. She was one of the first women to tour the US on behalf of the Scottish Whisky Association. When she was there, somebody who interviewed her in the 1960s actually said, "You'd expect whiskey making to be a male preserve." Bessie Williamson proves this wrong. Sadly, I don't think she proved it quite firmly enough, because that's still very much something I hear today. But she definitely took major strides and was a pivotal person within the Scottish whisky industry overall, and of course for the Lefroy brand. Margie was also very interesting. Margie and her husband Bill founded Maker's Mark, and Bill is credited with a lot of the work on the liquid there. I think Margie played a big role there too. But Margie actually delivered some of the things that have made that brand famous and so recognizable. She created the name. She critically created the packaging, which is incredibly distinctive and really set a very different world for bourbon at the time. And she created the red wax, which is the iconic red wax. One of the reasons that consumers recognize the brand on shelf and in bars across the world is that incredibly distinctive red wax. That was all her. She also, incidentally, came up with the idea that a distillery should be somewhere that people could visit. They could see what was happening and they should be welcomed there. In effect, I think laying out the future of the bourbon trail, which is now so important to us as an industry. So the frustration I have is we have these fantastic stories. We have proven from the inside of the industry that women could play a key role. And there are many phenomenal female master blenders and distillers working today. But somehow that's not always breaking through. So have we made progress? I think we have, absolutely. I think in the recent years there's been an improvement in the way that our category has been seen. But I think we should also acknowledge a lot of the category still shows women in a relatively objectified and passive way. And I think it's been very interesting to watch the recent discussions around the Whisky Bible. Hopefully most of you are aware of the challenges we have with the Whisky Bible edition this year, coming out with some language often comparing whiskies to women in terms that were extremely problematic. And there's been an incredibly strong condemnation of this, and I really would like to thank all of the whisky producers who've stood up and called this out as unacceptable. It has been fantastic to see the industry respond that way. But in a way, it's amazing we're still having this conversation. The language within the Whisky Bible bluntly belongs, or even in the 1960s, should have been unacceptable. The fact we're still debating this in 2020, for me, is quite shocking. And it's quite shocking that it's been tolerated for so long. And again, it's not that one thing, but it is the build-up. It is the combination over years of all of those small signals, all of that language that have established that tone was acceptable in the world of whiskey and that has done damage. And that damage, because it has given consumers a very strong signal, because it has created memories for them about what the whiskey category is about, will take time to undo. So we still have a huge amount to do, and I think we have to think very hard as an industry, as the spirits industry and whiskey in particular, about what's it going to take to build up a different set of memories, to build up a set of memories consistent enough to overcome a lot of that past, which has embedded and been accepted pretty deeply into society, into culture, into the way consumers think about us. So what do we need to do? I think there are really three big things. The first one is you have to put connecting with new consumers at the heart of growth. As I've said, growth is going to be critical for us. Without growth, we are really going to struggle to come out of this tough time and to move past it. And there is a huge amount of data now building on a lot of scientific studies of how marketing works, how brands are built, which says that to grow and to grow sustainably over time, you have to be constantly recruiting new consumers, new users into your category, into your retail environment. Yes, of course, there are opportunities in trading up, getting people to pay more. There are opportunities in driving frequency. But one of the biggest drivers of growth in every case they've almost looked at has been bringing in new consumers. So that has to be the heart of your growth strategy. And to do that, you have to think very carefully about what are the groups that are underrepresented. I think in marketing, we still often default to where do we do quite well? How do we push that further? And you see that in the way that we action. If I think back to the way we buy media, we will often over-index for male drinkers. If you think about the way in travel retail, perhaps we think about the layouts and the availability of products across different terminals. We're quite often baking into that our existing user base. And I think the challenge is to articulate a growth strategy that really does push to connect with new users and to think about how to bring them in. And in a lot of cases, particularly in the world of travel retail, when we look at the projections going forward, that's going to mean a greater emphasis, particularly on Asian travellers, who are also showing to be some of the most resilient as we come out of COVID, but also amongst women. And as we've seen, women are travelling and perhaps not engaging with us as much as they could at the point of purchase. So there's a very strong reason why we need to do this, but I think you have to articulate that at the heart of your growth strategy, and that has to be understood through the business. This is what we are trying to do. These are the new people we are trying to reach, and that has to be interrogated in terms of what is it going to take to do that. Not with superficial cliches. I've lived through a lot of that, particularly in the beer world, of making women like beer, and brilliant suggestions often, like, what if we made it pink? Go beyond the obvious, go beyond the cliche, go beyond the sometimes quite patronizing approaches, and really think hard about what is going to connect. Do your homework on these new groups, know them as well as you know your existing users, because that will open you up to a whole world of growth that we all desperately need. The second big thing that I think we need to do is to constantly assess the experience we deliver. As I said, brands are memories, sets of memories that are created by tangible experiences. And we have huge power when we create that experience, particularly in the world of travel retail, when that experience is human to human often, or is very visual, is very impactful. Those are the types of experiences that punch above their weight. But think, therefore, very, very carefully about how you create that experience and how you signal with that experience to your potential consumers. I've seen too many categories and, to an extent, too many channels fail or underdeliver or stop growing because they have not been thinking about all of the elements of their experience and how that was framing themselves in consumers' minds. And I think when we think about our world, think carefully about things like the brand ambassadors or the sales assistants. How are they trained? Who do you tell them to approach? What do they offer and why to those different types of people? And how do you think about making that process as inclusive as possible? Have they been trained in unconscious bias to actually recognize some of those things that are inherent in all of us? And have they been trained to think about how they might flip that on its head and actually open up people to some new experiences? Have you looked at your point of sale? Have you looked at the visuals? Have you looked at the way that they're communicating? Who do they show? What do they show? Again, every touch communicates something, and make sure it's communicating what you intend. Point I raised earlier, what do you stock where? Are you making sure that the terminals are not just playing to the strength of today, but are opening those groups up of consumers and travellers coming through to new categories, ones they may not have considered? Are you delivering phenomenal experience on those new categories that can help you for your growth, help you get new people in? So I think that forensic attention to detail in every aspect of the experience you create, and looking at it through the lens of how does this land with one of the new consumers I'm trying to bring in, one of the new groups that I've identified, whether that's a different group from a multicultural, or a gender basis, doesn't matter. But have that filter, look at your growth strategy, and then really dissect the work that you're doing, what you're putting in front of them, every single touch point, to understand the impact that it's likely to have. And work with us as your suppliers to tell us when you're not getting the material you need, when you feel that what you're getting is maybe reinforcing your current audience instead of attracting the users and drinkers that we want tomorrow. And lastly, more internally, obviously, you've probably gathered this, I think it's critical that you have diversity within your team. But that's not enough. As I said, I think there's been a huge amount of focus on diversity, and that's been very powerful. And diversity measured by the numbers is manageable to look at, to track, to discuss, but you have to then make sure that the areas of equity and inclusion are receiving the same attention to detail. Diverse talent who are not empowered to speak out, who are not empowered to be heard, is not going to bring you the benefits that you need. So diversity in the room is critical, but if you have that diversity without having that sense of inclusion and that sense of equity, it will not really get you anywhere. And I've seen that personally at many points in my career. I've often been one of the few women in the room, particularly in my years in beer. That was a fairly common occurrence. I sort of almost stopped noticing it. I've even been referred to on some occasions as, quote, the diversity, which is a somewhat strange experience to have. And whilst I would say I've been phenomenally lucky in the experiences I've had the support of some wonderful people, some very good companies, people who supported me, supported my career, supported my development. I was often conscious at different points in time that there were things I could not say. And that was really for two reasons. One was that bringing that perspective would not have had the positive impact on the outcome that I wanted it to. Pointing out that something was not going to be inclusive of women, that it was not going to connect with women, or could actually turn women off, would often not be listened to and would not be responded to, would not be actioned. But the second part was also, I had a concern often in those occasions that it wouldn't just not have a positive impact, it could have a negative impact on me. And I saw that with other people. I saw that being seen as being humorless, being seen as overly sensitive, often as a woman being accused of being unable to cut it or being overly emotional. So you start to self-censor. You start to hold back on those things. And we see that as well, for instance, in focus groups. We've put things in front of focus groups and afterwards looked at them and gone, that wasn't really what we should have done. And we've scratched our heads to say, why did nobody in the focus group say that? Why didn't we hear that? And it's because we didn't create the environment. We did not create an environment in which people felt they were heard and it would be actioned, it would be taken seriously, and they did not feel that there were no repercussions for them bringing that forward. So as a leader, that is your responsibility, not just to get the diversity in the room. That is step one. But step two, to make sure that that diversity is free to bring those messages, to free to bring their experience, that that experience is listened to, respected, and acted on. So look hard at the dynamics you have within your teams. Look at the share of voice. Look at the body language. Look at the way that challenging opinions, perhaps based on very, very different experience of the world, are listened to, are responded to, because that can cause friction. Less diverse teams in the short term perform better because everyone agrees with each other. It's comfortable, but it's not the right route for growth long term. But watch how the dynamics are working, and where you do not see that level of inclusion happening, take quick and active and visible steps to address it. Because my hope is, having been through some of that myself, albeit in a very privileged way, I would love it if our younger leaders coming up through the business have a different experience. Have an experience where their voices are listened to, welcomed, not just passively, but actively. You are seeking out different experience. You're seeking out those opinions. And when you do that well, it's incredibly powerful. So I hope that has given you some thoughts about how to tackle women in leadership, the benefits of having women in leadership, but also how you can make them thrive. I think this is a key journey for us in the pursuit of growth, in returning our business to the healthy growth that we've had in the past together. I think addressing this, understanding how to bring new people into our category, and understanding how to leverage diversity to create the results that we want, to create the business impact that we want, as well as creating the culture that we want within us, inside our companies, is going to be hugely important to all of us. And I very much look forward to being part of this journey with you. Thank you.